The world is a very strange place, and sometimes the people you think you can trust turn out to be the ones you should have been running from the entire time. A few years ago, I decided to do some freelance work as a private investigator. Now, if you are like most people, you probably think that being a private investigator is this incredibly exciting, fast-paced job filled with high-speed car chases and dramatic confrontations. But the reality of the work is actually much different. It is not nearly as cool as it sounds on television. For the most part, the job is just sitting around in a parked car for hours on end, observing people and documenting what they do. It is a lot of simple, tedious surveillance work. Television shows and movies definitely exaggerate what the job is really like. During my time working as a private investigator, I did not usually observe anything earth-shattering. Most cases were pretty standard, like tracking down people who were lying about injuries for insurance claims. But there was one specific case that always bothered me. It was a case that really showed me just how messed up and obsessive certain people can get when they do not get what they want. In order to protect the privacy of the woman who was involved in this story, I am going to call her Sue. About 6 months into my freelance career as a private investigator, I ended up meeting Sue. She was a young, highly confident woman who had actually started her own business. Her company was wildly successful, and it was still growing rapidly every single day. I admired Sue in a lot of ways because she had started with absolutely nothing and had managed to build this entire successful company all on her own. Well, she did not do it completely alone. When she was first starting out, she went out and gathered several investors who believed in her vision, and they helped her get the business off the ground. One of these investors was a longtime friend of hers named Steve. Now, at first, Sue completely refused to take any money from Steve. She did not want to mix business with friendship because she knew how messy that could get. On top of that, they actually had a little bit of a history. They had gone on a few dates very early on in their friendship, but they both quickly realized that they were much better off as just friends. They had known each other for several years by this point. They originally met at Sue's previous job. Before she started her company, Sue worked as a bartender, and Steve was one of her regular customers. Sue did not know his exact age, but she assumed he was probably about 10 years older than she was. According to Sue, and several other people who knew him, Steve was the kind of person who constantly gave off the aura of an incredibly wealthy man. He drove a flashy Corvette. He always looked like he was dressed and ready to attend an important corporate business meeting. And he was always the very first person to whip out his wallet to buy everyone drinks at the bar. Whenever Steve came into the bar, Sue would tell him all about her big dreams and the business she wanted to start. Steve would constantly offer to give her the money she needed to get started. He offered it to her almost daily, but Sue always politely refused. He would insist on giving her the money, telling her that he wanted to see her succeed, but Sue held her ground. She did not want to owe a friend anything, but eventually Sue hit a massive financial wall. She ran out of capital, and her other investors could not provide any more funds. She was incredibly close to making her dream a reality, but she was just short of the money she needed to finish the job. She never wanted to take money from a friend, but it felt like Steve was her absolute last hope, so she finally relented and accepted his investment. But she was about to find out exactly why you should never do business with your friends, especially friends you have a romantic history with, even if that history was very brief. Not long after Steve gave Sue the money, his entire behavior changed. He became incredibly possessive and mentally abusive. Sue actually saved all of the phone calls and text messages from this period of time, and she showed them to me. It was unbelievable. This guy was calling her non-stop. We are talking 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, completely blowing up her phone. Sue was absolutely terrified to change her phone number, and she was afraid to get the police involved because she felt this massive burden of guilt. She felt like because she had taken his money, she was obligated to deal with his behavior. And then, things got even worse for Sue. Whenever she would try to go out on a date with another man, Steve would somehow find out, show up at the venue, and start harassing her date. One night, Sue went out for drinks with a guy she had been seeing for a little while. Steve actually followed them to the bar. When Steve saw the man put his arm around Sue, he walked right up to the guy, punched him directly in the face, and knocked him completely unconscious. I still do not know exactly how he managed it, but no charges were ever filed against Steve for that assault. Sue claimed it was because of his extreme wealth and influence, but I was not entirely sure about that. According to Sue, this intense harassment went on for months. She was deeply conflicted and incredibly stressed out. She had already used the vast majority of the money Steve had given her to build her business, so she could not just hand it back to him. She had put everything she had into making her company work, but she felt like she was completely suffocating because of this guy. It got so bad that she became convinced he was stalking her apartment at night. She would wake up in the absolute middle of the night and hear what sounded like soft, deliberate footsteps walking around outside her bedroom window. This constant paranoia made it absolutely impossible for her to date, to sleep, or to focus on growing her business. She felt like she was living in a prison. Everywhere she went, she would look in her rearview mirror and see a red pickup truck, which she always assumed belonged to him. And then one day, with absolutely zero warning, Steve just vanished. Sue stopped seeing the red pickup truck parked near her apartment. He stopped showing up at her office. She no longer heard the terrifying sound of footsteps outside her bedroom window at night. It was like her life was suddenly returning to normal. Sue desperately hoped that Steve had finally just moved on with his life and decided to leave her alone. Eventually, she felt safe enough to start dating again, and there were no surprise appearances or attacks from Steve. For a couple of years, Sue lived with this constant expectation that Steve was going to jump out from behind a corner, but as the years continued to pass, there was absolutely no sign of him. Her company finally took off and became incredibly successful. She was making great money, and she eventually bought a beautiful new house to start the next chapter of her life. But once she settled into her new home, she started thinking about Steve a lot. It was not because she missed him or wanted to rekindle their friendship. She wanted to calculate exactly how much money he had invested in her company and pay him back every single cent. She wanted to do this so he would never have anything to hold over her head ever again. She wanted to officially sever any remaining tie to him. So Sue tried to get a hold of him, but the phone number she had for him was completely out of service. She tried looking him up on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, but he did not have a single social media profile. She even drove back to the old bar where she used to work and asked the staff if anyone had seen Steve, but nobody had seen him in years. It was like the man had just completely vanished off the face of the earth. Sue was frustrated, but she was ready to just let it go and move on with her life. And then, in the middle of the night, everything changed. Sue was fast asleep in her new house when she was suddenly awakened by a loud, heavy knock at her front door. She crept out of bed, walked down the hallway, and looked out the small window next to her front door. Outside, standing on her porch, was a tall figure wearing a dark hood pulled over his head. She could not see his face, but in her gut, she felt absolutely certain that it was Steve. She had nothing to base this on other than her pure intuition, but she was terrified. The figure knocked on the door again. Sue stayed completely silent and did not answer. She watched through the window as the hooded figure just stood there on her porch. He waited there for about 20 minutes, just staring at the door, before he finally turned around and walked away into the darkness. The very next day, Sue contacted me, and that was when she sat down and told me this entire story. She told me she did not want to play games anymore. She wanted to hire me to find Steve so she could hand him a check, pay him back his investment, and officially close that chapter of her life. I agreed to take the case and started digging. But as soon as I started my investigation, things took a very weird turn. After doing some deep background checks, I discovered that the name Steve was not even his real name. It was a complete alias. On top of that, I could not find any legitimate records of where this man had gotten all of his supposed wealth. It turned out he had played this exact same game in several other towns under completely different names. He would show up, flaunt his wealth, drive expensive cars, and try to win the affection of young women. But the most alarming thing I found was that the absolute last record of him existing anywhere was the day he stopped contacting Sue over 2 years ago. All of his known aliases had gone completely quiet. The apartments he had rented in other towns were no longer inhabited by him. He had essentially fallen off the grid. While I was in the middle of this investigation, the hooded figure returned to Sue's house in the middle of the night. Sue called me immediately, panicking. I jumped into my car and rushed over to her house, but by the time I arrived, the figure was already gone. I spent a little bit of time searching the immediate neighborhood, but I did not want to wander too far from her house in case he doubled back. Sue was absolutely terrified that this person was indeed Steve, and that he was going to keep coming back until he got inside. I decided that the only way to handle this was to set up a stakeout. I spent the next few nights sitting in my car, parked down the street from Sue's house, watching her front porch. I told Sue that if he showed up again, I would be there to catch him. Sure enough, at around 2 o'clock in the morning on the third night of my stakeout, I saw a tall figure wearing a dark hood walk up to Sue's front porch and knock on the door. I immediately opened my car door and started to approach the house. But as soon as I stepped out, the hooded figure spotted me. He did not hesitate. He took off running into the dark. He was incredibly fast, but I managed to keep my eyes on him. He ran past the edge of Sue's yard and disappeared into a heavily wooded area right next to her property. Instead of chasing him into the dark woods alone, without knowing what he had on him, I decided to go back to Sue's house first to make sure she was okay. She was trembling with fear. I told her that she needed to pack a bag and go stay at a family member's house right away, just to be safe. Once she was safely on her way, I waited. Right at sunrise, as soon as there was enough light to see, I went into the woods to try and track this person. I walked slowly through the thick trees, looking for broken branches or footprints. After walking for a few minutes, I stumbled across something that was absolutely terrifying and completely unbelievable. Hid deep in the thickest part of the woods was a small, crudely built shed. It was constructed out of old scrap wood and tarps. I approached it very slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached out and gently pushed the door open. Immediately I was hit by a horrific putrid smell. It was the smell of someone who had been living in filth without bathing for an incredibly long time. Fortunately, there was nobody inside the shed at that moment. As I looked around, I saw food wrappers, empty cans of beer, and soda cans scattered all over the dirt floor. But the absolute worst part of this little shelter was not the smell or the trash. It was what was sitting in the corner of the shed. There was a wheelchair, and sitting in that wheelchair was a full-sized mannequin. The head of the mannequin was slightly beaten up, and someone had covered it in heavy makeup and placed a blonde wig on top of it. And sitting directly in the lap of the mannequin was an old photograph of Sue and Steve from the days when she worked at the bar. It was costly and clearly meant to represent Sue in an incredibly sick, twisted way. I felt a chill run down my spine. I immediately stepped out of the shed, pulled out my phone, called the police, and gave them my exact coordinates. I explained everything that had been happening and what I had just found. A few minutes later, I walked to the edge of the woods to meet the police officers and lead them back to the shed. We quietly surveyed the area, waiting to see if he would return. Not long after the police arrived, we heard the sound of footsteps. The hooded figure walked out of the trees, completely unaware that we were there. He walked right up to the shed, stepped inside, and actually started talking to the mannequin as if it were a real person. The police officers immediately moved in. One of the officers knocked heavily on the shed door and ordered the man to come out with his hands up. The second the man saw the police, he became completely enraged. He let out a scream and lunged forward, trying to attack one of the officers. But the police were ready for him. They quickly tackled him to the ground, subdued him, and placed him in handcuffs. When they pulled back his hood, it was indeed Steve. The police had absolutely no idea how long he had been living in those woods, sleeping in that disgusting shed, and watching Sue. It was a terrifying realization. If Sue had never reached out to me, and if we had not discovered that shed, there is no telling what Steve would have eventually done. He had not tried to break into her house yet. But seeing that wheelchair and the mannequin, it was obvious that his intentions were incredibly dark. What is so frustrating about this entire situation is that we never got any real answers from Steve. He refused to speak to the investigators. We never found out where he had gone during those years he vanished, or how he had lost all of his money and ended up living like a feral animal in the woods. The man they arrested that day was just a shell of a human being. I know that Sue is still trying to recover from this absolute nightmare, and honestly, I do not know if you ever fully recover from something that twisted. It just goes to show you that even someone you consider a friend can end up being a monster. Now, when you think of private investigators, you probably think of professionals who know exactly what they are doing. But as I learned the hard way, that is not always the case. I have always been someone who is incredibly easy to influence. One of my many personal faults is that I am incredibly susceptible to peer pressure. It is really not that hard to talk me into doing pretty much anything, even if it is a terrible idea. When I was younger, I was constantly getting into trouble for doing stupid things, just because my friends dared me to do them. For example, I actually got expelled from my very first high school because I tried to steal my principal's car. I did not even want the car, and I did not know how to hotwire it. But my friends dared me to do it, so I did. Unfortunately, this major weakness of mine carried over into my adult life. A few years ago, I started getting this really bad feeling in my gut that my fiancée was cheating on me. I did not have any real proof, just a nagging suspicion. Instead of handling it like an adult and talking to her, I decided to confide in a few of my friends. But instead of giving me good, rational advice, they immediately started feeding my paranoia. They told me that if I was having these feelings, then there must be some truth to it. They told me that women are incredibly good at hiding these things, and that I needed to find out the truth. I let all of those toxic thoughts burrow deep into my brain. Pretty soon, I could not sleep, I could not eat, and I could not even function without constantly thinking about what she might be doing behind my back. One of my friends eventually told me that I should hire a private investigator to track her every move instead of just confronting her. At first, I thought the idea was completely ridiculous. To be completely honest, I did not even realize that being a private investigator was a real job in the modern world. I thought it was just something they added to movies and television shows to make the plot more suspenseful. But because of the constant pressure from my friends, I decided to do what you should absolutely never do. I opened up my computer and looked up private investigators on Craigslist. I did not know if hiring someone to follow your fiancé was even legal, so Craigslist seemed like the only place where I would find someone willing to do that kind of work. The entire time I was searching, I felt incredibly anxious. I assumed the anxiety was just because of the sketchy nature of what I was doing. After a brief search, I managed to find a listing for a local investigator. He was the only one close to my area, so I reached out to him. His name was Shane. We exchanged a few messages back and forth, and we agreed to set up a place to meet in person to discuss the details. Shane suggested a local public park that was pretty close to my house. While I was driving to the park to meet him, I felt absolutely horrible. I felt incredibly sketchy and guilty, but the obsessive thought that my fiancée was cheating on me had completely taken over my mind. I arrived at the park, parked my car, and walked around for a while. I texted Shane a few times to let him know I was there, but he did not answer right away. It was about 30 minutes later when he finally sent a message back, telling me exactly where to meet him. I walked over toward a large oak tree in the center of the park, fully expecting to see someone dressed like James Bond, wearing a nice suit and sunglasses. Instead, what I saw was a tall, slightly overweight man wearing a pair of incredibly dirty, beat-up sweatpants and a stained t-shirt. I stood there looking at him, thinking to myself that there was absolutely no way this guy was Shane. But then, he looked right at me and waved me over. I walked up to him, and he formally introduced himself as Shane. Then, he turned to the woman standing next to him and introduced her as his girlfriend Gabby. He could clearly tell that I was very sketched out by their appearance. He immediately told me not to worry about Gabby being there. According to Shane, she was his professional partner and worked with him on all of his cases, so I could trust her completely. Gabby was dressed even more unprofessionally than Shane was. She was wearing dirty slide sandals and pajama pants, obviously. Their physical appearance was not doing anything to make me feel better about this situation. I know that there is not exactly a formal dress code for private investigators, but I had assumed they would at least look somewhat professional. Before I could even say anything, Shane acknowledged how unprofessional they looked. He told me that dressing like this was actually a crucial part of the job. He claimed that they needed to look as average and dressed down as possible, so they could easily blend into any crowd without drawing attention to themselves. It sounded a little bit ridiculous, but at the time, my brain desperately wanted to believe him, so I just accepted the answer and we moved on. We all walked over and took a seat at a nearby wooden picnic table. Shane immediately started asking me some very basic personal questions, like my home address, where I worked, and what my fiancé's daily schedule was like. But then, the questions started to get weirdly personal. He started asking highly intimate questions about our relationship, our sex life, and our financial situation. They were the kinds of questions that felt completely irrelevant to tracking someone's whereabouts. But because I was desperate and assumed this was just part of the professional intake process, I answered all of them. After a few minutes of talking, we finally agreed on a price. Shane told me that I would need to pay him half of the money right now as a deposit, and then I would pay him the remaining balance once he delivered the actual evidence of the cheating. He insisted that he only accepted cash because he wanted to do the entire job off the books. I remember reluctantly reaching into my pocket and handing over the thick envelope of cash. I had this sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach that I was being scammed, but I handed the money over anyway. Shane took the cash, stuffed it into his pocket, and told me he would be in touch very soon. An entire week went by, and I did not hear a single word from Shane. I tried calling and texting the number he had given me several times, but I never got a response. I was starting to feel incredibly stupid. I was completely convinced that I had been scammed out of my hard-earned money, and that I would never hear from him again. But then, one night, I was fast asleep when my phone buzzed. I looked at the clock, and it was exactly 1:16 in the morning. The message was from an unknown number. I opened it, and it was Shane. He told me that he had been forced to get a new phone and a new number, which was why he had been out of touch. He apologized for keeping me in the dark, but then he said something that made my heart drop. He told me that he had just uncovered some information of vital importance regarding my fiancée, and that I needed to meet him right away to see it. He insisted that it absolutely could not wait until morning. This made absolutely no sense to me. My fiancée was sleeping right next to me in our bed. In fact, she had been home with me the entire day. But my brain was so clouded by paranoia and sleep deprivation that I was not thinking logically at all. I started texting him back, asking if we could just meet at a coffee shop in the morning. But Shane quickly responded and said that by morning it would be too late, and the information would be useless. Shane gave me an address and told me to hurry. He also made sure to remind me to bring the remaining cash balance for the final payment. Because of the job I had at that time, I was on call 24 hours a day, so it was not unusual for me to get up and leave the house in the middle of the night. I quietly got out of bed, got dressed, and snuck out of the house. The address Shane had given me was about a 10-minute drive from my house. The entire drive there, my mind was racing. I was a complete nervous wreck. I could not even begin to imagine what kind of horrible information he could possibly have that was so urgent. I pulled up to the address, and my heart sank. The house was completely dark, and it looked totally abandoned. The grass was overgrown, and the windows were covered. I parked my car on the street, feeling incredibly uneasy. I was not even sure if I was in the right place. I tried calling and texting the new number Shane had reached out on, but there was no answer. I sat in my car for a few minutes, staring at the creepy house. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Shane. All it said was, "Doors open." I texted him back, asking if he could just step outside and meet me by my car, because I was not comfortable going inside an abandoned house. He immediately responded and said, "The door is unlocked, just open the door and come inside." Every single instinct in my body was telling me that this was wrong. I knew I should just start my car and drive away. But for some incredibly stupid reason, I opened my car door, got out, and walked up to the front porch. I reached out, grabbed the doorknob, and turned it. Just as he said, the door was unlocked. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. It was nearly pitch black. The only light was the faint glow from the streetlights outside. I took a few steps into the dusty hallway and called out Shane's name. Nobody answered. The house was completely silent. I was getting incredibly freaked out, and I turned around to leave when my phone buzzed again. The text message said, "I hear you upstairs. Sorry, I forgot to tell you we are in the basement. That is where our office is. Just go to the door on the far left of the room and come on down." I stood there in the dark, looking over at the door on the far left. Every single alarm bell inside my head was screaming at me to run. I walked over to the door anyway, opened it, and looked down. The staircase led down into a completely dark abyss. There were no lights on down there. There was absolutely no sign of an office, no sound of voices, nothing. It was just a black hole. It was at this exact moment that the reality of the situation finally broke through my thick skull. I realized that every single red flag up to this point should have kept me from ever stepping foot inside this house, but I had been too blind to see it. As I stood at the top of the basement stairs, staring down into the darkness, my phone buzzed one last time. The text read, "Are you coming down, or are you just going to stand there all night?" That was finally the absolute last straw for me. I did not reply. I slowly and quietly backed away from the basement door, turned around, and ran out of the front door of the house. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, started the engine, and sped away as fast as I could. At first, as I was driving home, I started to wonder if I was just being paranoid. I wondered if I had made a massive mistake, and if I should have just trusted them. But then, a few minutes later, I received one final text message from that number. It simply said, "Good for you, buddy. Take care." When I read those words, a wave of cold terror washed over me. It was a clear acknowledgement that they had been watching me, and that they knew I had escaped their trap. I did not respond to the message. The next day, I tried calling the number again, but it had already been disconnected. It was completely obvious to me that Shane and Gabby had scammed me out of my deposit, and they were actively trying to lure me down into that dark basement to rob me, or potentially do something much worse. When I went back onto Craigslist to look for their original posting, it had been completely deleted. For the next several months, I was an absolute wreck. I lived in constant fear because Shane had my home address, my place of work, and all of my personal details. Every single little noise I heard outside my house at night made me jump out of bed, thinking that Shane and Gabby were trying to break in. Eventually, the stress became too much to bear, and I broke down and told my fiancée everything. She was obviously very upset and hurt that I had suspected her of cheating, but she sat me down and assured me that she had been completely faithful to me. We decided to work through my severe trust issues together. A few months later, we managed to move into a new apartment in a different neighborhood. Once we were settled into our new place, I finally felt safe again. Looking back on it, I know I should have reported Shane and Gabby to the police, but I was too embarrassed and ashamed of what I had done. I ended up just cutting my losses and moving on with my life. But it still makes me sick to my stomach to think about how incredibly close I came to something horrible happening to me in that basement. I am just thankful that my survival instincts finally kicked in at the very last second. It was definitely a case of better late than never. All I can hope is that Shane and Gabby are not still out there, using Craigslist to lure other unsuspecting, paranoid people into dark basements. While some people hire fake investigators to lure you into dangerous traps, other times, actual, licensed private investigators are hired by people with incredibly dangerous and obsessive motives. As many of you probably remember, the year 2020 was not exactly the greatest time for most people. But for me, it was even more difficult. In February of that year, I accepted a brand new job that required me to move to a city that was 8 hours away from my hometown. I had barely been living in this new unfamiliar city for a month, when the entire world shut down because of the pandemic. It was incredibly hard for me because I did not know a single person in the area, and I was completely isolated and alone in my apartment. After a few months of staying indoors and staring at the walls, I decided that I needed to try my absolute best to get out there and experience the world. Even with all of the safety restrictions in place, it did not take long for me to end up downloading a few different dating apps. To be completely honest, I was not looking for true love or a serious relationship. I just wanted to casually meet some new people, have a nice conversation, and maybe make a connection or two to help ease the loneliness. Over the course of a few months, I went on a few casual dates with a couple of different guys. None of them turned into anything serious, which was completely fine by me. The guys were all nice enough, but they were looking for a committed relationship, which was just more than I was willing or able to give at the time. I was purely using the dating apps as a tool to get back out into the world. But then, I swiped right on a guy named Wade. Wade was handsome, intelligent, funny, and on paper, he was pretty much everything you could possibly want in a partner. But right from our very first date, I felt like something was just slightly off. It is hard to describe, but he just gave off a weird vibe. Something in my gut told me that he was not quite what he seemed. In the past, I had made the mistake of forcing relationships that did not feel right, and I had promised myself that I would never do that again, but I did want to give him a fair chance, so we ended up going on a few more dates. I tried my hardest to see if a spark would develop, but it just never did. I assumed that Wade felt the exact same way. We started texting each other less and less, and eventually, our connection just naturally fizzled out. I went on with my life, and I assumed that Wade went on with his. Neither of us made any attempt to reach out to the other. After things ended with Wade, I decided to take a break from dating for a few weeks. The lonely, depressing feelings had started to fade, and I had actually managed to make a few good friends in the area. But a few weeks after my last date with Wade, I started noticing a gray SUV with dark, heavily tinted windows parked outside of my house. Now on the surface, seeing an SUV parked on a public street is not strange at all. But what made it weird was that this vehicle was never there before, and now, suddenly, it was parked there every single night. After about a week of noticing this, I started paying close attention to my neighbors' cars to see if someone had bought a new vehicle. But as far as I could tell, nobody on my street owned a gray SUV. That weekend, I drove over to the local grocery store to grab some food. While I was walking through the aisles, I got this horrible, creepy sensation that someone was actively following me. The store was incredibly crowded, so it was almost impossible to tell if I was actually being followed, or if I was just being paranoid. I finished my shopping and walked back out to my car in the parking lot. When I got to my vehicle, I noticed that parked directly next to me was a gray SUV with dark tinted windows. I tried to tell myself that it was just a coincidence, but it completely freaked me out. I quickly loaded my groceries into my trunk and got into the driver's seat. As I was driving out of the parking lot, I had to pass by the front entrance of the grocery store. I looked over, and standing near the doors was a tall man with slicked back hair and dark sunglasses. He was staring directly at my car. In fact, it looked like he was staring directly at me. I felt a wave of anxiety hit me. I did not want to wait around to see if he was going to get into the gray SUV, so I quickly drove away. I tried to push the creepy feeling out of my mind, because I had a date lined up for later that afternoon. I was meeting a guy named Paul for coffee. This was my very first date since things had fizzled out with Wade. I met Paul at a local coffee shop, and the date was going absolutely wonderfully. Paul was incredibly charming, funny, and I felt this instant genuine connection with him. It was the first time in a long time that I had actually felt a real spark on a date. But while we were laughing and talking, I happened to glance out the window of the coffee shop, and my heart stopped. Parked right across the street was the gray SUV. Paul could tell immediately that something was wrong, because my face went pale and my demeanor changed instantly. He asked me if I was okay, but I was too distracted. I started scanning the coffee shop, trying to see if the tall man with the slicked back hair was inside. And then, I saw him. He was sitting at a small corner table right next to the entrance, casually playing on his phone. This was no longer a coincidence. This man was actively stalking me. I did not want to freak Paul out or ruin the date by telling him that a creepy man in a gray SUV was following me everywhere. I was worried that if I told him, He would think I was crazy and would not want to see me again. So, I made up a lie. I told him that I had an urgent work-related issue that I needed to go take care of immediately. Paul was incredibly understanding. I felt horrible for lying to him, but I felt like I had to get out of there. We said our goodbyes, and I ran out to my car. I decided to take a very long winding route home to try and throw the SUV off my trail, but it did not work. A few minutes into my drive, I looked in my rearview mirror, and there it was. The gray SUV was driving a few cars behind me. I kept driving around for another 20 minutes until I finally managed to lose him in traffic, and then I rushed home and locked my doors. That night, I decided to text Paul and explain the real reason why I had acted so strange and left the date so abruptly. To my relief, he was incredibly understanding and supportive. While I was texting him, I walked over to my living room window and peered outside. My heart sank. The gray SUV was parked right outside my house again. I texted Paul and told him I was panicking. Paul immediately told me that I needed to call the police and report what was happening. I realized he was right, so I called the non-emergency line and explained the situation. A short while later, a police cruiser pulled up. I watched from my window as the officers approached the gray SUV. The tall man with the slicked-back hair opened his door and stepped out. I expected him to look nervous or angry, but he looked completely calm. He calmly spoke to the officers, and then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet, showing them some kind of identification. After talking to the man for a few minutes, the police officers walked up to my front door and knocked. When I opened the door, the officer informed me that the man in the SUV was actually a licensed private investigator. He had been hired to follow me. I was completely shocked and absolutely terrified. I pressed the officers for more information, asking who had hired him, but they told me they could not release that information. It felt like an absolute violation of my privacy. I had only been in this city for a short time and barely knew anyone. Who would go through the trouble and expense of hiring a private investigator to follow me? After the police left, I looked back out the window, and the gray SUV was finally gone. The next few days were incredibly stressful. The SUV did not return, but I could not shake the constant heavy feeling of being watched. Not knowing who had hired the investigator was driving me crazy. I tried my best to just move on with my life and hope that the whole creepy situation was over. A few weeks later, Paul and I decided to go for a hike at a beautiful state park nearby. It was a gorgeous day, but as we started walking down the trail, that familiar creepy feeling returned. I felt like someone was watching us from the trees. It was not just me either. Even Paul kept stopping, turning around, and looking back into the dense woods. I tried to make light of the situation and joked that it was probably just another private investigator trying to get what the other could not. We both laughed and kept walking, trying to enjoy our day. When we finally completed the loop and got back to the parking lot, Paul said he was going to use the restroom before we hit the road. I stood outside the restroom building, looking down at my phone. Suddenly, I heard the sound of heavy, rapid footsteps running toward me. I looked up, and sprinting out of the tree line was Wade. Before I could even react, Wade lunged forward, grabbed my arm in a tight grip, and screamed directly in my face. He started shouting that I had been unfaithful to him, but that he was willing to forgive me, and that I needed to get into his car with him right now. I was absolutely terrified and started screaming at the top of my lungs. Hearing my screams, Paul burst out of the restroom door. He did not hesitate for a second. He charged forward and tackled Wade directly to the ground. Wade scrambled back to his feet, looking completely furious. He started shouting threats at both Paul and me, but Paul stood his ground, refusing to let Wade get any closer to me. Realizing he was outnumbered and that people were starting to look, Wade slowly began to back away into the parking lot. Paul grabbed my hand, led me to his car, and we locked ourselves inside. The very second we were safe, I called the police and reported the attempted abduction. At first, the police could not do much because there were no cameras in the parking lot, and it was essentially a case of our word against Wade's. But believe it or not, it was actually the private investigator Wade had hired who ended up saving me. It turns out that while the investigator was following me, He quickly realized that I was not actually in a relationship with Wade. Wade had lied to the investigator, claiming that I was his cheating wife. As the investigator watched me, he realized that Wade was incredibly unstable and potentially dangerous. The investigator had actually warned Wade to stay away from me. When the police contacted the private investigator, he cooperatively told the officers everything. He explained that Wade was highly obsessive and posed a serious threat to my safety. Thanks to the investigator's statement, I was able to successfully obtain a restraining order against Wade. Shortly after the court hearing, Wade completely vanished. He deleted all of his social media accounts, disconnected his phone, and seemingly moved away. I have not seen or heard from him since that day, but to this day, I am still terrified that he might find me again. What scares me the most is that I barely knew this man. We only went on a few casual dates, and yet he went through all of that trouble to hire an investigator, stalk me, and try to force me into his car. If Paul had not been there with me that afternoon, I have no idea what Wade would have done. I truly believe that Paul saved my life that day. It has been a few years now, and I can only hope that I never see Wade again. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.